Continuing along the history of this site, I'd like to ask a fellow Montreal Irish Monument Park Foundation director, Mr. Donovan King. I took Donovan's Irish tour yesterday. Not that I needed the history, or so I thought, before attending the walk, but it is so informative, so entertaining. Donovan does such a great job. I really felt that I could not pull off another discussion about the history of the Irish in Montreal. So I'm going to give it to Donovan, who has a very unique way of just focusing on the important points, and I'm sure everybody, even those who know the story, will still hear parts that are very intriguing. Thanks, Donovan.
Thank you, Victor. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you once again for coming out to the walk to the Stone today. My name is Donovan King, and I lead Irish walking tours here in the city, and I also work with my brother, Dr. Jason King, who's in Dublin City, Ireland. He's the foremost leading expert in the world on the Canadian experience in regards to the Irish famine. And today in Ireland, they're actually going on a 6-day famine walk from the Strokestown estate, which was one of the estates that was the worst affected by the famine. Over 1,000 people were evicted from this estate. They were forced to walk overland for 6 days to Dublin, and then they were put on ships to Liverpool, and then the coffin ships across the Atlantic Ocean. And so in Ireland, they're doing the same thing that we're doing here today. This is becoming more and more common to commemorate the Irish famine throughout the world. Now, from Liverpool, on those coffin ships, these were ships that were never intended to transport human beings. These were Canadian lumber ships for the most part. And usually they bring ballast on the way back across the Atlantic, which is filled in the bottom of the ships, like stones to keep them upright. But in this case, they would take on these Irish emigrants who were already starving from the famine. And of course, they were crammed below decks. The food wasn't nutritious enough. There wasn't even enough water for anything except drinking. So you couldn't wash yourself if you were on board one of these coffin ships. Now, this proved the perfect breeding ground for a disease called ship's fever, or typhus, which is spread by the Rickettsi bacteria. It's spread through lice, insects biting people, and that type of thing. And after a 10-day incubation period, if a person contracted typhus, they would become very sick. They would feel headaches, dull pains, and eventually, if the complications developed, in about a third of cases, they would develop a delirium and then a deep stupor. Their skin would turn black, and at that point, they would die. Now, during the crossing, thousands of these people were tossed overboard into the ocean, those who died at sea. And those who arrived upriver here in the St. Lawrence River, they were stopped at Grosse Ile, where they have a quarantine station. The quarantine station was unable to stop the spread of this disease, despite teams of doctors. 5,000 people were buried there, but the disease did move upriver that summer to Montreal. And in the month of June, that's when the first ships began to arrive. On the 4th of June, 3 ships arrived, and 2,304 Irish emigrants were disgorged onto the wharves. It was Calcutta-like heat that summer, and these people began collapsing, those who were the most affected. Now, at the time, there were only 2 fever sheds at the entrance of the Lachine Canal. These were left over from a cholera epidemic of 1832. These were completely unable to handle the influx of the diseased refugees. Now, Montreal was very lucky that year because we had an exceptional order of nuns called the Sisters of Charity, or the Grey Nuns. And they immediately sprang into action and went to care for those refugees. We also had an incredible mayor by the name of John Easton Mills, an American man actually, he wasn't even Irish, and he sprung into action as well. He decided to build new fever sheds at the site of Wellington Bridge, and he personally went to care for the refugees at the hour of midnight to give the doctors and nuns some much needed respite, despite the enormous risk that it caused for his own personal health. Now, in the month of July, the Irish had spread pretty much throughout the city, because that summer, 75,000 Irish refugees descended on Montreal, a city of only 50,000 people. So you can imagine that would be like 6 million refugees arriving in our city this summer. Can you just imagine how overwhelming that would be? Well, unfortunately, come the month of July, the citizens were starting to get upset about this because the typhus was spreading through the entire city. Now, an angry mob assembled on the Champ de Mars parade grounds. They decided to take action into their own hands, and they threatened to go to the site of the fever sheds at Wellington Bridge and to toss the sheds into the river along with all of the refugees to get rid of the problem once and for all. Now again, the mayor at the time, John Easton Mills, very heroic, he decided to move the site of the fever sheds from Wellington Bridge to right behind you where we now have this parking lot. 22 fever sheds were erected in total, and another 6,000 people were buried here at this very site. There's also burial sites that most people are unaware of, one over at Wellington Basin and the other one at the entrance of the Lachine Canal. There's also bodies buried along the length of the canal. So this was the third site of the sheds. And by the coming of the autumn, with the cooler weathers, it began snuffing out the typhus. And people began to ask, well, where exactly was the mayor? Because they hadn't seen him in a while. It turns out that John Easton Mills, our old mayor, succumbed to typhus on the 12th of November, 1847. He made the ultimate sacrifice to care for the most destitute and desperate of refugees coming here into our city. And so he's someone who, again, is not very well known in our history. He's not very well honored. And so he's someone we definitely want to pay a lot of homage and respect to as well, along with all of the Irish here, along with the 3 orders of nuns who went to their aid, the Sisters of Charity, the religious hospitalers of the St. Joseph, and of course the Sisters of Providence as well. And so there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit of history behind the site where we're now standing today. So I thank you once again for coming out, and I do encourage those who are going to be involved in the upcoming discussions about this memorial park. So I encourage you to remember this incredible story and to really provide an exceptional setting because Montreal really is the last city in the world without a proper commemoration to the Irish, despite the fact this was the first monument ever, and it's also the largest burial ground outside of Ireland from the famine. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Donovan.